Brilliant. So welcome everyone to this, which is our second session of Ideology, Society and Medieval Religion, a seminar series. So for those of us for whom this is your first session, this is a seminar series that's all about the social dimension to medieval religion. So we're interested in how did people interact with the institutions of their faiths? How did religious bodies exert or fail to exert their authority over different groups in society? And what were the links between belief, ideology, and practice? Now, this series grew out of research interests and conversations about medieval religion, theory, and ideology between myself and my colleague, Emmy, who's also here tonight, and many of our colleagues here at the Centre for Medieval Studies at York in the UK, and through various reading groups, such as the Medieval Religion and Critical Theory reading groups that we've both been involved in running here. This series was born out of both of our commitment to genuine interdisciplinarity. So that's a working methodology bringing together approaches and researchers from different fields and disciplinary backgrounds, which the CMS at York does so much to support. Now we have broadly a programme of events lined up over the coming months, including seminars looking at consent and the law, the materiality of liturgical objects in Galicia, and ghosts in later medieval England, among other topics. We are inviting more contributions of abstracts, so although we have events planned for the remainder of this academic year, we are still in the process of developing our schedule for the autumn term onwards. So we are eagerly welcoming proposals for new seminars in this series. If you are interested in sending in abstracts or want to be added to our mailing list, please do email myself or Emmy. We'll be posting details in the chat below. So that's my email. Moving on to today's seminar, we are delighted to welcome Kirsty Francis. Kirsty is a PhD candidate in English at the University of California, Los Angeles. Today's talk comes from the first chapter of her in-progress dissertation project, Queer Magic, Sodomy, Sin, and the Supernatural in the Later Middle Ages. You can find more of her work forthcoming this year in Painful Pleasures, Sadomasochism in Medieval Cultures, currently in production at Manchester University Press, and in the winter 2021 issue of Medieval Feminist Forum. This latter article, Alchemy, the Liber Aureus and the Erotics of Knowledge, was the winner of the Society for Medieval Feminist Scholarship's 2020 Best Graduate Essay Prize. She can be reached on Twitter, and I'll just drop the handle here. And she says that she's very happy for people to live tweet this talk. So please note that we are recording Kirsty's paper. However, the recording will not pick up anyone else's video feed, and we will not be recording the Q&A, or rather we won't be recording sound at the Q&A. So you don't need to worry about your video or audio being captured. So take it away.
Thank you so much for that introduction. I'm thrilled to be here with you all. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge the unceded Tohono O'odham land from where I give this talk. For the non-Americans among us, land acknowledgements are not praxis in and of themselves, but are instead a recognition of the ongoing colonization of Indigenous peoples who are still here in North America, and a predicate for honoring and supporting them in their work for sovereignty and self-determination. I am so grateful to Tim Wingard, Emmy Rose Price Goodfellow, and the University of York for inviting me to speak today as part of the Ideology, Society, and Medieval Religion seminar series. Though I'm obviously not at the university right now, I've made several solo pilgrimages to your institution in the past, and I'm absolutely thrilled to virtually participate in its fantastic medieval community. Indeed, I was shocked to learn that over 450 people registered for this talk. So zero pressure for me, thanks. I know that many of us present may be neither medievalists nor academics, and I want to encourage those folks to please ask any clarifying questions you'd like during Q&A. I hope that, academics or not, you'll leave today knowing more than you ever thought you would about magic, sodomy, in the Middle Ages. To kick things off, I'd like to start with two medieval texts on the origins of sodomitical desire. This first quote comes from Peter Damian's Liber Gomorrhianus, or the Book of Gomorrah, an 11th century treatise condemning the sexual vices of the clergy and encouraging ecclesiastical reform. Damian, a father of the Catholic Church, was himself a monk. The Liber Gomorrhianus continues to shape modern Catholic theology on natural law and sodomy. In these lines, Damien claims that, quote, when a man rushes to a man to commit the act of sodomy, it is not the natural drive of the flesh, but entirely the goad of diabolical impulse. That is, sodomitical desire originates in the influence of demons, who drive otherwise heterosexual men to sin contrary to the laws of nature. It's important to note here that the Liber Gregorianus dates prior to the First Lateran Council of 1123 or Gregory VII's 1074 encyclical enforcing clerical celibacy. Although Damien is concerned with the spiritual welfare of all sexually active clergy, he solely condemns those members of the church who commit unnatural sex acts, which I'll expand upon shortly. 400 years later, in 1486, the German inquisitor Heinrich Kramer wrote the Malleus Maleficarum, a violently misogynist guide to hunting, interrogating, and killing witches. Although written in the 15th century, it did not gain widespread popularity or endorsement until the height of the European witch-burning craze a century later. In one section on sex between humans and demons, Kramer contends that incubi and succubi, male and female demons who have sex with women and men, respectively, are immune to the vice of sodomy and, quote, of any other sin whereby the act, aka the sexual act, is wrongfully performed outside the rightful channel. Indeed, according to the Malleus, quote, all devils equally, of whatsoever order, abominate and think shame to commit such actions, because they are vices against nature, or contra naturam. In other words, for Kramer, writing at the end of the Middle Ages, sodomy is so detestable and contrary to nature that not even demons would dare commit it. So what happened? In both texts, demons and sex acts are intrinsically linked. In the Liber Gregorianus, demons directly cause all sodomitical sex. Indeed, the connection between demons and sodomites is such that those who commit sodomy are categorized alongside those who call upon and are influenced by demons. In the Malleus, however, we see that magic, although magic is still connected to demons and sex, after all, this passage comes from a broader meditation on the relationship between magical practitioners, demons, and sex acts. Sodomy and other unnatural vices are now anathema to the very demons that in previous theological understandings perpetuated them. Not only do these seemingly disparate texts share a belief in the connection between sex and demons, but they also invoke the medieval concept of sins contra naturam, or against nature. The concept of sins contra naturam underpins my entire dissertation project, as well as the way that magic, sodomy, and the supernatural were linked throughout medieval culture. In its most commonly understood definition, quote, a sin against nature refers to any sex act that violates Christian natural law. These acts include incest, masturbation, bestiality, same-sex intercourse, adultery, heterosexual sex for pleasure, and heterosexual sex that challenges the paradigm of active male and passive female participants. Fun fact, this last distinction is why it was always worse in both ancient Rome and in medieval Europe to be the passive, penetrated partner in a same-sex sexual act rather than the active. The active partner was at least acting according to his masculinity, while the passive partner was acting in a woman-like manner. It is these acts I'd like to propose that can be viewed as what we would today call queerness. Medieval queerness in my work should be considered distinct from modern queerness. However, I intentionally use the word queer as a shorthand to signify that these sexual engendered acts against nature were considered an explicit challenge to medieval cultural and religious mores, which, just as modern queerness does to heteronormativity, reveals the instability of the concept of nature itself. Yet these queer sex acts were not the only forms of sin that challenged nature in medieval theology. And it is this instability of naturalness, and in turn challenges to naturalness, that form the basis of my talk today. One of the ways the Middle Ages sought to manage nature and sexuality was through magic, spells, treatises, and natural law. And what I hope to show today is how nature and magic, although they seem to contradict one another, actually work according to the same logic, but to different ends. Though my dissertation itself covers several centuries, today I'd like to focus on the status of nature, sexuality, and magic in continental Europe during the 12th and 13th centuries. By examining medieval understandings of sexuality, magic, and nature, we can better understand the implications of this slippage and ultimately see how it was exploited by medieval writers and thinkers. 3 broad questions guide my research. First, how do cultural anxieties regarding the idea of nature surface in medieval depictions of magic? Second, To what extent does the presence of the supernatural in medieval literature reveal the instability and mutability of the designation of naturalness? Finally, how do such depictions help us think about constructions of and challenges to medieval performances of gender, sexual desire, and sexual practices? The very definition of nature changed throughout the Middle Ages, as did understandings of the acceptability of various forms of magical practice. As I'll demonstrate today, medieval magicians had a very different conception of the legitimacy of their practice than did canonists and theologians. I'd ultimately like to suggest that throughout the Middle Ages, magic is fraught with queer potential, and by invoking magical arts in their literary works, medieval writers and thinkers implicitly draw upon the tension between naturalness and unnaturalness to experiment with and question the tight relationship between gender, sexuality, and nature. Thus far, I've introduced several terms that require clarification, and I'll spend the rest of my time today working through them and their literary implications. First and most important is the concept of nature, which takes several guises throughout the Middle Ages. Second, I'll explain precisely what I mean when I speak of magic. Finally, I'll turn to Alan of Lille's 12th century allegory, De Planctu Naturae, or The Complaint of Nature, as my central case study of magic's queer potential. I focus today on the 12th century because it has long been identified by scholars as the moment when natural philosophy and magic became synthesized. Indeed, in his groundbreaking work, Nature, Man, and Society in the 12th century, Marie-Dominique Chenu identifies 12th century Europe as the origin of the discovery of nature. Though absolutely correct regarding a specific type of nature, specifically the codifying and embodying of nature into the allegorical figure natura, capital N, first established in Bernardus Silvestrus's Cosmographia, medieval understandings of nature and naturalness are well rooted in early teachings of the Church Fathers. St. Paul the Apostle, one of the foundational thinkers on sodomy in the Christian tradition, describes in his epistle to the Romans sexual acts that incur the wrath of God. He particularly condemns those who, quote, exchange natural relations for those who are contrary to nature, singling out men and women who engage in shameless acts with their own sex. For Paul, there is no distinction between internal desire and external action. Later, in his letters to the Corinthians, he distinguishes between fornication and proper sexual acts. After establishing that, quote, it is good for a man to not touch a woman, Paul argues that the only way to avoid fornication, and thus sin, is to confine desire within the bonds of marriage. He suggests that only procreative intercourse sanctioned by vows of wedlock are natural under divine law. All other acts are unnatural fornication that will lead to divine retribution. 3 centuries later, St. Augustine likewise indicates that divine and thus natural law restricts sexual union to acts intended to procreate children. He further castigates the acts of sodomites because they are contrary to nature. Even if, Augustine argues, all people engaged in same-sex acts and thus transformed those acts into normative behaviors, they would still face divine law, for God, quote, has not made man to use one another in this way. Augustine here refutes Paul's suggestion that homosexual desire and homosexual acts are equivalent. While he criticizes actions between members of the same sex, Augustine makes no mention of the unnaturalness of same-sex desire. Writing contemporaneously with Augustine, Jerome expands upon the relationship of same-sex acts and desires to the dichotomy of the natural and unnatural in his commentary on Paul's epistles against Jovinianus. His treatise rails against the claim that marital sex and virginity are analogous, writing that, quote, while we honor marriage, we prefer virginity, for virginity is the state in which one enters the world and is thus naturally good. Jerome argues that if, as Paul claims, it is good for a man not to touch a woman, then any physical act between the sexes must be unambiguously bad, quote, for there is no opposite to goodness but badness. He condemns intercourse not only because it is the ultimate form of touching between man and woman, but because it distracts men and women from their devotion to God. Jerome's emphasis on the relationship between virginity and naturalness emphasizes that, as we will see with Alan of Lille, patristic writers imagine the natural as the foundational category through which sexual desire and actions must be understood. By the 12th century, The shameless acts first alluded to in the works of St. Paul were unequivocally understood to include both sexual actions between those of the same sex, as well as non-reproductive fornication. To return to our friend Peter Damian, he outlines 4 types of sins against nature in the Book of Gomorianus. First and least serious is masturbation, followed by mutual masturbation, and then intergirl intercourse. The final and most grievous sex acts are between those of the same sex, which he calls the complete act against nature. All 4 of these sex acts, Damian argues, arise from one sodomical impurity. By grouping them together under the category of sins against nature, Damian synthesizes the positions of Paul, Augustine, and Jerome. While, like Paul, Damian explicitly marks same-sex intercourse as an act against nature, he makes concrete what Augustine only suggests and Jerome takes to the extreme. Any non-procreative sex act, regardless of marital status, is an act of sodomical impurity, a definition further corroborated by Thomas Aquinas a century later in his Summa contra gentiles. Aquinas defines the rules of natural relationships, arguing that nature is handed down by divine interdict, and any emission of seed done, quote, in a way that generation cannot ensue is a sin. He specifies further, sexual acts done, quote, without the natural union of male and female are said to be against nature. These theological treatises establish rules of normativity and nature that are enacted throughout the Middle Ages and, as we shall see, resonate even today. By categorizing sex acts into what is either natural or contrary to nature, patristic writers strove to construct an oppositional and impermeable boundary. For my project, I'm particularly interested in emphasizing how these writers envision nature in terms of the result of the act deemed contra. That is, since the discourses regarding most acts considered against nature in these texts focus upon their foreclosure of generation or reproduction, rather than a fascination with the specific bodily sites of intimate touching, I plan to interrogate the ways in which the category of contra naturam seems inextricably linked to a sort of heuristic of intervention in a larger process of understanding futurity. My use of nature within this talk, then, refers to that organization of law and order that medieval philosophers claimed to structure the known universe. This structure is distinct both from divine and juridical law, in that, despite their own creation of an allegorical natura, medieval thinkers did not believe that nature and natural law were handed down by an outside authority. Rather, natural law is intrinsic to the universe, even as it is subservient to God. Naturalness, then, refers to those concepts, acts, practices, and ideas that operate within this framework, while unnaturalness encompasses all efforts to contravene or exceed the boundaries of this structure. It is critical to note here, however, that the boundaries and limitations of nature, and thus the constructed binary of naturalness and unnaturalness, shift over the centuries. As my opening quotes from the Liber Gomorianus and the Malleus Maleficarum suggest, these definitions are shaped by their cultural moment. This brings us to the second section of my talk. Medieval understandings of magic are just as fraught with concerns about the boundaries of nature. Just as debates about nature reveal, either implicitly or explicitly, anxieties about the threatening power of non-binary thinking, magic served as another way of both making sense of the universe and attempting to control it. Indeed, one of the central tenets of magical theory in the 12th and 13th century was arcana naturae, or the secrets of nature, which could only be uncovered by a learned, typically male, magus. Sorry, ladies, we are not allowed to be learned magicians in most magical texts. Medieval magic arose out of Hellenistic philosophy, shaped especially by the works of Plotinus, Proclus, Lucretius, and Aristotle. To these latter philosophers, all physical objects had occult or hidden qualities that could be found in nature. These could create medicine or aid in sorcery, but most importantly, the causes of these occult properties existed completely outside of rational thought. Only the learned magus, gifted with the ability to access the secrets of nature, could utilize these qualities. Harnessing these occult powers, in turn, empowered the user, providing a strong impetus for studying the secret qualities of nature. The magician's desire to control the secrets of nature directly parallels the role of secrecy in controlling and occluding unnatural gender behavior. These correlations become even more apparent when considered alongside what William Eman suggests drove the desire for medieval books of magic. The real appeal of these works was not their secrecy. It was their promise of virtually unlimited power over nature, over one's enemies, over the uncertainties of chance. Revealing nature's secrets gave the magus unlimited power, but even more importantly, it offered him the ability to overcome chaos. Understanding medieval magic requires a deeper understanding of its history. Because magic is socially constructed, its definition, like that of the natural and unnatural, fluctuates over time based on context. Throughout the Middle Ages, the permissibility of magic was constantly in question. Etymologically, magic, or magia, first referred to the magi, or Zoroastrian priests of Persia. Their magical activities were little known, however, and magic encompassed a wide variety of inconsistencies, foreshadowing the continuing instability of the term. Although originally a neutral term, magia was slowly replaced with a word of far harsher connotations, maleficium, or evil deeds, as magical practices became further prohibited in the 4th and 5th century CE. This shift arises out of the stringent biblical condemnation of magical acts in the book of Deuteronomy. Let there not be found among you any who shall sacrifice your son or daughter, leading them through the fire, or who divines from animal entrails, or observes dreams and omens. Nor let there be any magician, maleficus, nor charmer, nor anyone who consults the Pythia, or fortune tellers, and who seeks the truth from the dead. For all who do these things are abhorred by God, and because of these sins, he will destroy them at your coming. Explicitly condemned are those magical acts which call upon spirits, or attempt to define the future, as well as those individuals who actively engage in the practice of magic. While divination was widely practiced in the Hellenistic world, made clear here through the reference to the Pythia, or Oracle of Delphi, such forms of fortune-telling were made possible through their gods, which to medieval theologians were the equivalent of demons. Indeed, divination was an integral aspect of maleficium, as it indicated an effort to obtain illicit knowledge and was only made possible through the invocation of evil forces. Further divisions of magic resulted out of this conflict between magia and maleficium, including the natural versus the unnatural, and the supernatural versus the preternatural. The natural, in this case, means that which occurs most of the time in nature's habit or usual course. The supernatural, on the other hand, is required by definition to be both beyond the scope of nature and yet caused by God. These are things like miracles. It is distinct, however, from the preternatural. The title of my talk is a bit of a misnomer if you're a scholar of medieval magic. Though in modern parlance we've conflated the meaning of supernatural and preternatural, it's in fact preternatural, not supernatural forces that are the sources of magic. In the 12th century, Gratian's Decretum would reiterate Deuteronomy's laws for canonists and theologians, confirming that magica, his term for maleficia, was viewed as a sin that attempts to surpass the will of God. Richard Kiekefer captures these slightly shifting categories in his delineation of two generally accepted classifications of medieval magic, demonic and natural. Kiekefer emphasizes the nuances inherent in these terms, asserting, quote, natural magic was not distinct from science, but rather a branch of science. It was the science that dealt with occult virtues or hidden properties within nature. Demonic magic was not distinct from religion, but rather a perversion of religion. It was religion that turned away from God and toward demons for their help in human affairs. In a later essay, Kiekefer expands upon his definition of natural magic, adding that, quote, it assumes that certain plants, animals, gems, and verbal formulas have power that cannot be explained in ordinary terms, but is nonetheless part of their natural condition and not due to supernatural intervention. Notably, the source of demonic magic is not necessarily explicit. That is, a magical text might not say, this was caused by a demon, the agent of the devil, but rather, through the description of the magician and the form of magic itself, it implies the invocation of evil spirits. We can see this clearly in magical texts from the period. Let's look, for instance, at a spell from the medieval magical handbook, the Picatrix. Originally a 10th century Arabic treatise on astral magic, the Picatrix came to the Latin Christian West as part of the larger project of Translatio Studii that exploded during the 11th to 13th centuries. Translated into Spanish and then Latin in the 13th century, The Picatrix was one of the earliest known and widest circulating magical grimoires in the High and Late Middle Ages. To understand the spells and rituals within it, practitioners must be themselves well-versed in natural philosophy. Its first chapters outline the organization of the natural world, and the ingredients in its recipes can be poisonous if not mixed with a full understanding of their properties. As is made clear in this Spell to the Sun, the compiler of the Picatrix did not characterize this art as demonic, but rather argued that it was the result of harnessing angelic forces. The writer asks that God bless the sun, indicating that these two forces are amicable, not opposed. He specifies that the power of the sun derives directly from God, and hopes that through the power of the sun and God's angels, Ancora, Anihutor, Actarie, Ahudamamora, and Bihartion, he will gain the friendship and love of all men. You'll also note that he concludes his spell with a prayer like Amen, driving home the fact that medieval magical practice was considered dangerous precisely because it could be seemingly confused with actual church liturgy and ritual. Much like unnatural sex acts, the ontological status of demonic magic was disagreed upon by theologians and canonists. Medieval natural philosophy, especially scholastic philosophy, was stuck in a double binding regarding the status of nature. The central tenet of medieval natural philosophy was that God had created the world and the universe and all things in it. Nature and natural law was, in turn, subservient to God's will. Demonic magic, unlike natural magic, was prohibited due to its reliance on the intervention of demons. Yet, as my opening lines of the Liber Gomorianus and the Malleus Maleficarum made clear, the relationship of demons to natural law was in no way clear or consistent in medieval theological thought. The cleric Anselmo Basate reflects on this contradiction in his 11th century Rhetoromachia, a rhetorical address to his cousin Rotalind, a wicked magician and fornicator. In an attempt to deny his own crimes, Rotalind has claimed that Anselm carries around a hoof of a mule and says that Anselm uses this hoof to abort fetuses with its magical power, thereby contravening the will of God. Anselm strongly denies this charge, however, and argues that such a thing is impossible. Quote, in a godlike manner indeed, the necessity of predestination can be prevented by some wickedness. Even the eternal order can be dismissed sometimes by the diabolical art, or celestial providence can, as you said, be disabled by some disgraceful act. But let no one of the faithful believe that the divine purpose, nor what necessarily is with respect to existence, may be revoked by means of some work of magicians or evildoers. These confused lines reflect the similarly confused ontological understanding of magic in the 11th and 12th centuries. Though Anselm states that magic through the interference of demons can disrupt the eternal order of natural law, he also asserts that no magic or magician can interfere with the will of God, nor permanently alter God's creation. William Eman claims that magic was the medieval world's paradigmatic example of forbidden knowledge, precisely because the boundary between natural and demonic magic was so ambiguous. This assertion, when read alongside Kiefer's definitions of natural and demonic magic, suggests that the acceptability of magic originates in the socially constructed binary of naturalness versus unnaturalness. Because natural magic arises out of an object's innate qualities that were instilled in them by God, the harnessing of these occult virtues is a licit magical practice that does not violate any ontological boundaries. Demonic magic, on the other hand, emerges directly out of an illicit desire to imitate the powers of God. As a perversion of religion, demonic magic in a medieval context likewise perverts the divine ordinances that structure the world as well as natural law. Like forbidden sex acts, the forbidden knowledge of demonic magic both relies upon and challenges these laws. Indeed, the anxiety that attends demonic magic emerges because the invocation of these spirits reveals the permeability of the constructed boundaries between the divine, the demonic, and the natural. To return briefly to Liber Gomorianus, when Peter Damian categorizes the Sodomites among those who worship or give themselves up to demons, then, he conflates unnatural sex acts with the preternatural, since those Sodomites were invaded by the same diabolical spirit. Construction just continued. Are we able to hear me okay? Cool. I'd like to spend the remaining portion of this talk on a literary case study, De Planctu Naturae, or The Complaint of Nature, by the 12th century French scholastic theologian Alan of Lille. Born in Lille and educated in Paris, and Chartres. Allen was a professor of theology at the University of Paris before he retired to monastic life. Much of Allen's theological authority was employed in railing against the unnatural. He followed up De Planctu with the Anti-Claudianus, another nature allegory, but it never reached the same level of fame as his Complaint, which was a popular Latin textbook throughout the Middle Ages. In his nature allegories, Allen consolidates a figure that Bernardus Sylvestris first indicates a decade prior. Dime natura, to interrogate the relationship between naturalness and unnaturalness. In Allen's text, nature appears to him and decries what she terms the degeneration of natural sex and gender. Calling herself the lieutenant of God, nature reinforces a hierarchy of power wherein she, and in turn all things natural themselves, are beholden to God's power and will. As Barbara Newman notes, medieval thinkers and writers used nature to, quote, explore the conflict between biblical literalism and cutting-edge scientific thought. That is, nature operated as a heuristic for understanding those things that were otherwise unexplainable. Nature allegories push this heuristic further by virtue of their genre. Rita Copeland persuasively demonstrates that allegory refers to two related procedures, a manner of composing and a method of interpreting. To compose allegorically is usually understood as writing with a double meaning, what appears on the surface, and another meaning to which the apparent sense points. Literary allegory has been treated by turns as a genre, a mode, a technique, or rhetorical device or trope, related to metaphor and sometimes defined as an extended metaphor. Writing specifically about medieval allegory, Noah Gwynn notes that this narrative form, quote, habitually draws the reader's attention to the discursive construction of reality, including the body and desire, to the play of meanings in discourse, and to the ambivalence of cultural artifacts generally. What Copeland and Gwynn point out is that allegory continually calls attention to the very instability of our constructions of what is and is not natural. That is, because allegory always has a double meaning, it is always a clue to something else. Allegory embodies the very multiplicity of meanings that frustrated medieval philosophers as they attempted to define naturalness. Built into these definitions is a perception of allegory as a heuristic of deciphering the unknown. What I'd like to suggest today is that magic operates as a similar heuristic, one that specifically grapples with the instability surrounding natural sex and gender. For Allen, it seems to make sense to pair the two together. These opening lines of De Planctu Naturae immediately encourage binary thinking. Allen speaks only in anaphoric oppositions, laughter into tears, joy into sorrow, cheers into complaints, jokes into tears. His vacillation between these affects is ultimately due to the magical art of Venus, who uses her power to silence nature's law and turn he's into she's. Allen's neologism of deviant gets directly to the point. Magic can remove manhood. Intriguingly, magic was considered a huge threat to masculinity throughout the Middle Ages. Almost every single magical handbook I've encountered includes instructions for solving impotence or for causing impotence. Women were frequently suspected of causing impotence in either their husbands or their male neighbors. In some instances, married couples could get divorced if they were unable to reverse the magical curse of male impotence. Yet impotence is only one of the implications of deviant. It also suggests that, when juxtaposed with the previous line, those under the influence of the magic of Venus are castrated, eunuchs rather than men. Yet magic cannot fully complete the transformation from one sex to another. Though the active sex degenerates to the passive kind, a man-made woman through Venus's enchantment is neither clearly identifiable as male or female, but as a hermaphrodite. These lines reveal the extent to which magic was viewed as intrinsically linked to non-normative gender performances and sexual acts. Just as Venus's magic forces Allen to create binaries to characterize his emotion, it also has a power to destroy binaries. Neither wholly male nor wholly female, much like eunuchs, hermaphrodites in medieval culture were seen as challenges to binaristic understandings of gender. Although natural philosophers and medieval medical texts suggested that hermaphroditism was a natural though rare occurrence, Joan Cadden has demonstrated that anatomically ambiguous individuals were, even in scientific texts, often seen as rebellious and disruptive in accordance with more widely held views in various sectors of medieval society. Cadden suggests that, despite their claims to the contrary, Many medieval thinkers reduced hermaphrodites to permutations of the conventional categories of masculine and feminine, which precluded any clear distinction between the various forms of sexual ambiguity. Canonists were particularly hostile to in their reflections on the unusual anatomy or behavior of ordinary people. Although it's possible to read the hermaphroditic body that results from the witchcraft of Venus as demonstrating the limitations of magic, I would argue that these details instead demonstrate that Allen is well aware that magic has the ability to subvert gendered and sexual codes. That is, he's well aware of magic's queer potential. His anvil and hammer metaphor plays with the popular medieval understanding of nature's forge, seen at left in this slide. Venus's magic is so powerful that this process of reproduction via nature's forge has become sodomitical. The anvil, or anus, cannot create offspring. Instead, the unmanned man plows in a barren beach. Here, magic directly disrupts the dichotomy of male versus female. In this prologue, Allen reveals that magic can create queer bodies and desires. These disruptive bodies, in turn, demonstrate that what was thought of as inviolate, the decrees of nature, subservient only to God, can be in fact broken down by magic. By connecting the magical art of Venus to these perversions of nature's laws, Allen in turn exposes the inherent instability of naturalness. Even when attempting to laud Natura herself, Allen inadvertently reiterates this instability. When he first encounters Natura, Allen details her garb, garment, and form over the course of 16 very, very long paragraphs. While the specifics of this description are fascinating, I'd like to focus today on one example, Allen's first direct verbal response to Natura. In these lines, Allen embodies the features of allegory that Copeland, Gwynn, and others have noted. His description of this allegorical figure immediately provoked problems, even as they attempt to define via words just what precisely natura or nature is. She is the die proles, or the offspring of God, an allegorical framing that implicitly challenges Christian teaching by granting her a position that is theologically unique to Jesus. He refers to natura as lucather orbis, or light bringer of the world, a seemingly positive description that simultaneously conjures up previous Lucifers, such as the angel that rebelled against heaven and was cast into hell. By referring to her as Lucifer in the midst of a medieval tradition that fully, if not exclusively, recognizes that epithet as synonymous with Satan, Allen contradicts the absolute authority of Natura, implicitly suggesting that she too may one day fall. These connections depend on the understanding of allegory as inherently interpretive. By writing in a genre that requires its readers to search for deeper meaning, Allen reveals the fractures in 12th century understandings of nature. This is the subtextual threat of allegory. Interpretation is a practice with no obvious ending. To pursue allegory to its further interpretive point is to reveal the very instability of our constructions of what is and is not natural. Allen goes on to describe her with an overwhelming series of nouns. Nature is, or perhaps represents, peace, love, virtue, government, power, order, law, end, way, light, source, life, glory, splendor, beauty, form, and the pattern of the world. Allen's phrasing here is almost manic, listing off a variety of objects, concepts, and things that are neither synonymous nor clearly linked. Natura is both the source and the end, peace and power, love and form. By using nouns rather than adjectives, Allen doesn't attribute these qualities to Natura herself. Rather, she is simultaneously natura and virtue, leader and species. If natura can mean anything, then it's also true that natura means nothing. If nature has created and controls everything, can anything truly be unnatural? Even as he goes on to assert natura's ultimate authority and ability to shape all things, Allen's descriptive barrage exposes the very lack of essential truth that claims of naturalness otherwise assert. To put this another way, this excessive description inadvertently exposes the quandary of categorizing naturalness and unnaturalness. These concepts are at their core ineffable because they are subjective rather than absolute. Even as his text aims to reassert the authority and boundaries of natura in the face of the magic of Venus, the very multiplicity of meanings that it generates in its description of the allegorical natura demonstrate that there is no objective reality to claims of naturalness. So what does this mean for the scholar of magic and gender? When read alongside 12th century's understandings of magic and sins contra naturam, De Plancto Naturae clearly acknowledges the queer potential of magic, even as it condemns sex acts and gender performances it deems unnatural. In its attempts to prove the horrors of sodomy, de Plancto instead calls attention to the instability of natural law, implicitly questioning theological and philosophical conceptions of sex and gender. I've been lucky enough this quarter to teach a class based on my dissertation project. Although we started with De Plancto Naturae, some of the most exciting conversations we've had this quarter emerged from applying its lessons to later texts, both medieval and otherwise. In Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, for instance, reading magic as a heuristic for grappling with non-normative performances in gender can reveal further implications on the text's late revelation that Morgan Le Fay's magical power has in fact instigated every action in the plot. Unhindered by periodization, my students have traced the legacy of magic's queer potential to more modern texts like Carmilla, only a medievalist could call a 19th century text modern, and The Chilling Adventures of Sabrina. In these texts, magical beings, vampires, and witches are both magical and subversive. They refuse to adhere to a normative understanding of sexuality and gender. What I hope this talk has demonstrated is two things. First, just how complex the relationship between magic, gender, and sex in the Middle Ages was, and more importantly, second, revealed new and exciting avenues for work in the field of magic and gender and sexuality studies. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. I'm sure I speak on behalf of everyone here when I say just what an amazing talk that was. Thank you so much. So we're going to move on to the question and answer section. Because we've got such a huge turnout tonight, what I'm going to ask everyone to do is that rather than try and switch mics on and off, I prefer if we can all put our questions that we have in the chat, and that way we can make sure that everyone gets their turn. So if you have any questions, please do put them down there. But just to give you some time to sort of think up your questions, I'll take the chair's prerogative to ask the first question. So what I wanted to ask is basically around the idea of popular versus academic magic and how maybe that kind of impacts thinking about magic and queerness. So obviously a lot of the texts that you've were talking about were particularly kind of, as you were saying, drawing on kind of natural philosophy and these very elite kind of academic philosophies and academic forms of magic. And kind of maybe, as I understand it, running parallel to that, there's also kind of traditions of sort of folk magic and sort of lay understanding of the magical world. So do you have any thoughts on how maybe that kind of tension between kind of folk and intellectual magic might play into this, or do you think that they're really in the same tradition more or less?
Thanks so much, Tim, for that question. That's a great one. Because yes, I am talking primarily here about learned magic, right? That's what demonic magic sort of requires, is this learned understanding. Natural magic and folk traditions, like natural magic is how theologians and natural philosophers kind of understand folk magic. They're like, oh, these folk magicians are drawing upon like the natural properties, right? If you are making a charm, for instance, for childbirth, and you are like gathering certain herbs, for instance, to make that charm, right? You're drawing upon the natural properties of those herbs. However, I think that popular magic, like charms, etc., is a great place to see just how unstable this kind of learned and elite attempt to construct like what magic is. That's where you see it kind of fall apart. For example, a lot of charms really blend religious liturgy and prayer with magical invocations, right? Kind of they do what the Picatrix example did, but on a less scholarly level, right? We find these charms often written in midwifery books, general guides, and looking at charms, although charms are not the focus of my dissertation project, I think can really open up new avenues. And I would love to like see someone do some cool work on charms and gender to kind of open up new avenues on like what popular magic makes possible that learned magic does not, definitely.
Brilliant, thank you. So we've got the first question from the audience coming up, which says, This is a great talk, thank you. And this person has two questions, both of which are about the theoretical shape of these ideas. First, you said that there's a difference between medieval queerness and modern queerness for you. Can you outline some of those differences? And second, how do you distinguish between the natural and the normative in your work?
These are great questions, and they kind of tie into one another, honestly, because there's, if for those of us who are medievalists on this call know, there is often, pushback, or there's a fraught relationship sometimes between like modern queer theory and literatures of the past. For me, I try to use queerness like in a very historicized way, which is why I try very hard to like distinguish medieval queerness from modern queerness. So I think the biggest change is how expansive to me medieval queerness can be. And I know this is sometimes very frustrating for scholars because it's like, well, queer is just a word that ends up meaning anything you want it to. I don't think that's the case. By using medieval guidebooks and like penance manuals, I've defined medieval queerness as these specific sexual acts that are contra natura. But as we've seen, that definition of what is a sex act contra natura is very different from like modern conceptions, right? In modern conceptions of like what is queer, we think, same-sex relationships, right? That's queerness. But medieval definitions of queerness, if queerness is something that challenges these structures of normativity, which I'll get to in a second, these are far more inclusive of different sex acts. In modern queerness, I would say it's very hard to make the case that like a heterosexual sex act could be queer. In medieval queerness, however, I think it's possible to see that acts like, an active female participant or adultery or sex outside of wedlock can be seen as a form of queerness. And so I try to look at those gaps and interrogate them. In terms of normativity, so Karma Lockery has a great book about heterosyncrasies. If you haven't read it, highly recommend. And heterosyncrasies points out that the term normative, like in some ways, Lockery is pointing out like a terminological debate. But she's saying heteronormative is a term that is a modern construction, just like Foucault claims that homosexual is, right? And that it's hard to talk about norms when we're talking about the past, because norm is a system of understanding that really is the product of 19th and 20th century sort of medical discourse and figuring out like what is normal and what's not normal. However, because I do think that I totally acknowledge Lockery's point, I think it's well made, because of the more informal nature of this talk. I didn't want to give I have footnotes, but I didn't want to give like a full explanation of this then. I do think that we can talk about norms if we recognize that that this term is anachronistic. There are many terms that we use today when we talk about medieval past that were not used then, especially like the Middle Ages, right? They didn't call themselves medieval people, but we use that term. So similarly, just because the concept of norms was not present, I do think we can see something akin to norms that's constructed through, for example, penitential manuals, canon law, right? Religion is really where I see these sexual mores getting established. So when I talk about normative, that's what I'm drawing upon, is what is established in these texts. And what's fascinating, right, is that like a lot of these norms, again, big asterisk by norm, but a lot of these norms are socially constructed, just like nature is. Yet both these norms and nature are considered to be like normativeness in medieval culture is the product of naturalness.
Definitely, that's a very quite clear sort of explanation of those differences. Brilliant. So the next question we have, it says, since magic is the ultimate performative linguistic act, the words for poem, song, and spell are all the same in Latin. This person is wondering how Alan's obsession with bad grammar, and particularly linguistic misgendering, so the failure to decline adjectives correctly, etc., how that fits in.
Great question. Yes. So something that was in the first version of this talk was a little digression about how Alan of Lille's De Punctu Naturae, part of the reason that it was a widespread Latin textbook was because Alan is writing one big grammatical pun. He loves playing with the sort of properties of grammar, and as this commenter points in, right, like misgendering, that failure of declining in Latin adjectives, right? He's requiring his audience to really understand Latin grammar to get the jokes and to get the full effect of his text, right? So I think that like that's what people have really focused on this text, which is why I didn't talk about it today, is because I wanted to look at something different. However, I think that they are definitely interrelated, right? Rules of grammar are attempts to control language, right? They are ways to kind of structure and control the way that we communicate, and thus language connects to kind of the way we think about things, right? There's been proven in linguistics that like language and cultural concepts are connected, that one creates the other, right? So Allen's emphasis on the failure of grammar, which is perhaps like a natural act in and of itself, the failure of grammar thanks to the witchcraft of Venus, reinforces again how magic destroys these structures. Magic takes something that's supposed to be logical, like grammar, which can be learned. And if any Latinists are among us, we know that like Latin, especially classical Latin, has very strict rules for grammar, right? And it's, you know, kind of like a puzzle. If you just know the rules, you can translate the text, right? Allen is saying that even these rules that are considered kind of inviolate, much like the rules of natural law itself, can be violated by magic. So that's what I see going on with that. In the dissertation version of this chapter, I talk about that a bit more, about how this entire text is about like how magic can break down boundaries. And one of those, but the biggest way that Allen draws that in is with his discussion about grammar.
Brilliant. So the next question we have is saying, thank you for your presentation. And this is coming from a PhD candidate at the Sorbonne who says, I'm working on the visual culture of magic during the medieval and Renaissance era. And so this person is wondering, have you ever encountered depictions, so engravings, drawings, etc., of homosexuality, male or female, in the context of the practice of the ars magicae?
That is a great question. Pierre, if you would like to, let me drop my email in the chat because I'm happy to, I have to go through some documents to get back to you on that. 1 second. So I'm sure that one thing, oh, nope, that's yours. That's not me. Sorry, I don't know why I typed your name. So one text I'd like to point you to, although it's talking about sodomy more broadly, I'm sure you're already aware of it, is Robert Mills's Seeing Sodomy in the Middle Ages, which is an art historical text about sodomy, right? And in that text, he gives some, I think I'm remembering some imagery where we can see in discussions of the supernatural, like two ambiguous bodies in bed together. However, more places that I see these like actual illustrations are in things like some like marginalia of magical handbooks, for instance, as opposed to like actually part of the text. So I think that's really interesting. There's a one I would point you to is talking about the Picatrix, for instance, and I can send this to you via email. So just shoot me an email. There's a manuscript where that's currently held in Poland, I believe, where the last like 20 pages are just doodles and drawings. And in my, like, just looking as I was preparing for this talk, because I was just like looking through those doodles, I was like, these are some very strange bodies and some like bodies that, you know, seem to be indicating intimacy between same-sex bodies. So I think that there is something there. Like, I was so excited. I was like, why has no one talked about these? I'd be happy to like send them your way if you want to take a look. Yeah.
Brilliant. So the next question we have is sort of thinking about politics and magic. So this person says, wonderful talk. Thank you so much. And this person is wondering, have you come across instances of magic attributed to female political figures in the medieval or early modern period? And this person was saying that they were specifically thinking of Catherine de' Medici, for instance, who knew Nostradamus and had a curiosity for astrology.
Yes, absolutely. And Catherine de' Medici is like the primo example for that, I would say. But there are definitely other instances of magic attributed to them. So for instance, Elizabeth I had John Dee, English astrologer and magician, as her court astrologer, right? And she would draw upon his advice a lot. So there's a lot of really interesting work if you look up, I'll put his name in the chat, John If you look up work on John Dee, what people have really emphasized or focused on is his role at Elizabeth's court and how they kind of interact. So that's a big one. Catherine de' Medici, as you said. Also, Sir Philip Sidney's sister, whose name is Mary, but whose real last name, Countess of Pembroke, was in part an alchemist, like has done or did work with alchemy. And that's another place that we see these things. So I talk about in my larger project how like alchemy is a somewhat preternatural science. So I would say that like that is another big place where we see where women appear. Like there are women alchemists who are practicing their craft like throughout 13th century Italy, right? And there are some women alchemists who very, very rarely, like super rarely, I'm talking like one every 4 centuries I know of, but like we have evidence of like women like taking alchemical classes, right? Or even though they aren't able to like fully be a part of the university system, which is for men, they were able to like be affiliated with it. So yes, I definitely think that there are some really cool examples there. They date a bit more late medieval than early medieval because a lot of what I see like from earlier medieval sources are things that maybe imply that like a woman is not in fact a human woman, but is like a demon. So I'm thinking about like, there's a myth about Thomas a Becket's mom. So not necessarily a political figure, but right, Thomas a Becket was a political and religious figure, that his mother was actually like a demon, a succubus, and like who disappeared after his birth, right? So there are some elements of like female magical practitioners and that way having larger political influence, just for example. But that's a great question. I'll keep thinking more about it.
Definitely. So next up, we have very kind of very briefly a sort of statement. So one person has said, so in terms of contemporary sexuality, I can see why it has been difficult to overthrow superstition and magic, as we may laugh at the unscientific nature of the appellations of various sexual desires, but in some uber-religious sectors, these punishing views are still mandated. So I guess maybe sort of following from that, do you have any other sort of thoughts about the kind of the contemporary sort of aspects or relevance of a lot of what you're sort of thinking about here?
Absolutely. So what I see my project in part doing is kind of excavating a new under-discussed avenue of kind of a history of sexuality, right? In the history of sexuality studies, in that we haven't talked about magic as related to sex and gender, but as this person points out, right, like these things still shape modernity. For instance, the version when I was looking for a text for my dissertation of like Peter Damian, all the versions I could find were like modern editions put out by the Vatican, right? They're like, people are constantly translating and talking about them. And then in the introduction of these texts, it's not presented as like, this is a definition from the past and things have changed. It's like, no, this is what we should be reaching back toward, right? Like this is what we need to remember as modern Christians, modern Catholics, like that this is what the relationship is between like sodomy and demons. So as this person points out, right, like there's still in many uber conservative parts, like I'm from the rural South, you know, there's definitely still beliefs that like there's a clear connection between being a homosexual and having demonic influence. And again, being like a magical practitioner who also has been influenced by demons, right? So I think that this person is spot on, definitely. And part of what like I am thinking about in my class as we're talking about later text or reading Twilight, for instance, right now, my students are really intrigued by the ways in which we, and as a society, cannot get away from bringing magic and sexuality together, and that these things continually reappear in our popular consciousness as implicitly connected and kind of really exposing, I think, a lot of like, you have to look at the magic to understand where the queerness is coming from, but when you do, it becomes pretty obvious. So I think that's a pretty cool thing about it.
Definitely. And so I think what you were sort of saying about the sort of the fact that these modern sources, the way that they're still being edited, kind of throws up some interesting questions about how we deal with that. And obviously with my own kind of experience of medieval texts, there's the very kind of, you know, infamous case around Eleanor Rickner in London, where obviously, you know, we didn't kind of the original transcript of that case had been kind of almost basically covered up by the original editors, and it wasn't until it was sort of rediscovered in the 90s that all came to light. So yeah, good reminder that our work as medievalists is always kind of highly political. So the next question we have kind of just asks quite simply, are there any more examples of juicy allegory related to magic that you might recommend people have a look at?
Well, not to give a plug for my dissertation, but in hopefully 2 years, less than 2 years, I'm looking at some previously undiscussed alchemical allegories that date from the 16th century. They haven't been edited, but I can, if this person wants to email me, my email's in the chat. I'm happy to kind of pass around my transcription of that. In terms of allegories, none immediately, oh, that's not true. The Roman de la Rose in there, it's allegorical prologue, brings in magic. Of course, that's more of a romance. And that's where I'd say that's where the bulk of my work, my dissertation work comes from. And if you're interested in that, a book, you want to see more of funky magic in literature, a book I highly recommend is Dr. Corinne Saunders has written Magic and the Supernatural in Medieval English Romance. In the chat for you guys if you're interested. And she has, the first couple of chapters do a really great overview of sort of the history of magic and the status of magic in medieval England. And the last few chapters just hit you over the head with a lot of great primary sources on it. Now, of course, she's only talking about romance. So if that's something that, you're looking specifically for allegories, I'm not the greatest help on that, but that's where I'd point you to.
Brilliant. So now we have a question that's sort of thinking about race in relation to magic and sort of queerness. So this person asks, are you aware of any connections between the subjects of kind of race, sexuality, and magic in this period?
Yes, absolutely. So I gave a brief shout out to translatio studii, which is the process by which knowledge from the Hellenistic and Arabic world was translated and transferred into the Middle Ages, medieval Europe, during the 11th to 13th centuries, right? So this whole process is about kind of taking Eastern knowledge as it's depicted in medieval sources and kind of making it European, right? So as part of that project, you get, so much implicit racism and Orientalism, and explicit. I find in texts, a lot of times, Saracens are blamed for teaching magical power practices to people. So in that Anselm of Besate Rhetoromachia text I alluded to, he blames Rotalind for learning sorcery from a Saracen. There's a lot of this sort of racialized discourse about what type of person will do magic. So I want to also put in, if you haven't already read Geraldine Hang's Invention of Race in the Middle Ages. She talks a lot about how religious identity is racialized in the Middle Ages. And so one way I see this constantly is in references, for example, to Jewish folks in magical texts or treatises. A lot of times Judaism is treated as a form of heresy that draws upon magic, in part because based on Jewish mysticism, but also in part based on the fact that there's a lot of magical treatises that have been translated into Hebrew that are translated out of Hebrew during the 12th centuries. So because of this translation project, there's a very clear understanding, I would say, in the Latin Christian West that magic comes from the Orient. It's often ascribed to India or to magi of the East, right? So that's this idea that that these traditions are something that is kind of coming in from outside, and thus there's a subtext to it of racialization.
Definitely, and I think that that's also quite usefully answered the next question that was coming up after that, which was sort of thinking about sort of the relationship between things like heresy, Judaism, other sort of forms of religious difference and queerness. So the next question we've got kind of stays actually with that theme of sort of thinking about religion and magic. So this question comes from someone who is a practicing witch, who would like to add that current pagan/magical practices use both the male and the female as deities, and some can be both or either. These days, sex acts are extremely optional and can be among any sexual gender. This person also notes that most of those that are against magic because of the connections with demons, it should be noted that in general there is no devil or demon in pagan religion. And so this person asks, have you looked at any literature from non-Christian sources as well as Christian?
Yes, absolutely. So I would say like the big ones for me for this are non-Christian magical texts. Now, I have, alas, limitations in my linguistic knowledge. I work on like medieval French, medieval Latin, medieval English, right, and Old Norse, but I don't have medieval Arabic, or I don't also know like medieval Hebrew or other languages. So when I'm looking at these texts, I often am finding them in translations. So the Picatrix, which I mentioned, you can access like a cool project that people might want to be interested in doing is taking the Arabic version of the Picatrix, which has been edited and translated, and looking at alongside the Latin version of the Picatrix to see where those things change, because we don't have that many extant, well, we have hardly any extant non-Christian sources that are written in a language that I can read in from the Latin Christian West. So that's part of the limitations of my research. But I would say that like those texts, like because hegemonically speaking, the Christian church kind of controlled all levels of sort of elite knowledge in medieval Europe. That is the kind of general understanding. And I want to point out, right, like the medieval church had a very poor understanding of pagan religion. Like it did not understand or did not attempt to understand like the actual practices behind Judaism, Islam, any other like religions that it encountered, right? It instead kind of ascribes a lot of, or it conflates a lot of pagan practices into one act. So that's part of the problem with looking at medieval sources describing paganism, because you're not quite sure how accurate they are or how much is sort of like a prejudice conflation. No.
Definitely. So we now have a question which says, so this person says, thank you for an interesting talk. This person just wanted to know if this kind of intersection of magic and queerness appears as strongly in the writings of medieval magicians, or is it primarily a feature of those who condemned all forms of magic?
Great. Yes. So where I see it in the writing of medieval magicians is like they're clearly talking, or at times they talk about spells or planets that control sodomitical desire. So because I did not have time to get there in my talk today, I had to cut this portion. But to return to my buddy, the Picatrix, there's a section when it talks about Venus and what Venus does. And part of what Venus does is that the planet Venus, a fortunate planet, wants to love women and encourages love between women. That is, calling upon the force of Venus will allow you to like, it specifically controls like sex between women. So if you want to somehow make a spell that will cause like women to have sex with each other and have other forms of like, he says, filthy and unnatural sex, right? Like Venus is who you'd call upon. We also see this in the Picatrix in Libra. Libra is the planet that controls sodomites. So like there's a very clear understanding in a lot of medieval magical texts. I know I'm giving one example, but it's the one that's immediate to mind. We see this in other magical texts too. So where we see it is not like a extended rumination by the magician on like, what is the nature of sodomy? But instead it's these references to sodomy that are inherent in the magical instructions or information that we can look at and say, oh my gosh, look, these things are connected in the magical texts themselves. They're not considered, it's not like something that magical writers aren't connecting. Yeah.
Cool. So we now have a question that's kind of interested in sort of, I suppose, both your dissertation project and also the course that you were teaching. that was asking, this person is curious if your course discussed the roman de silence, this kind of romance which draws on Lille's idea of nature, and kind of just wondering in general about if you have any thoughts about silence in connection with your kind of ideas about gender and magic.
That is such a good text, or that's such a good question, because the roman de silence is something I'm still fighting with in understanding. So I did not teach it to my students, just because I only have 10 weeks at UCLA and it's a text I don't want to spend a lot of time on. But it definitely, as you point out, like the roman de silence, it's a romance that also allegorizes nature versus nurture, and it really engages with this. And at the end of this text, as you point out, Merlin appears, right? Merlin's a wild man in the woods, and Silence, who was born female but was raised as male, or was assigned female as birth, was raised as male. Merlin ends up Silence tricks Merlin to get knowledge, but Merlin ends up exposing the secret of Silence's aberrant gender, right? It's thanks to Merlin that basically Silence gets stripped down before the court, and everyone says, oh my gosh, who we thought was a man is a woman. My thoughts are, I don't know. When I'm thinking about the roman de silence, as I've been grappling with it throughout my dissertation, I'm trying to decide if it is like, is this an example that demonstrates the limitations of my argument, in that like magic via Merlin tries to like instead impose like a normative framework, right? It's like what magic is, what destroys the ability of Silence to like maintain their masculinity, and instead Silence gets married to the king of France, right? Kind of a nice little heterosexual bow at the end. Silence gets married to the king and is happily ever after a woman, right? Or does this text again reinforce, by like bringing magic and gender together, that like magic continues to, excuse my curse, fuck things up when it comes to these binaries and these understandings? So anyone hearing this is like, wow, Kirsty, I have so many thoughts on what you just said, and I would love to share them with you and talk to you about the roman de silence. Please feel free to contact me, because I would love to talk about it in magic with you and help figure out what's going on in that text.
I've got a lot of love for Silence. We've done it quite a lot in our old French class, so it's a very fun text to translate. So our next question is sort of thinking about clerical identity. So this person asks, this is an absolutely fascinating talk. Thank you for a very lovely talk. But this person is curious if you have any thoughts about the identity of our learned authors as largely religious men, and the association of the clerical underworld with necromancy or magic, especially given the accusations of sexual corruption often levied at the clergy.
Y'all are asking amazing questions. I feel like I've secretly planted these all, but I haven't. Yeah, so the clerical underworld, that's a term that Richard Kiefer uses to describe kind of the largest body, or a large body of magical practitioners in the Middle Ages. As this questioner points out, it's often clerics themselves that are engaging with magic, right? Like these are not necessarily, although there are, accusations, right? Like Roger Bacon and Gerbert of Aurillac are both major theological figures that are accused of being magicians in their time. We see a lot of like accusations also levied against popes after their lifetime for being secret magicians, right? But in, at least according to historical record, the more provable case is that lower orders of clergy would be the ones to use, would often be the ones to use magic. And that's because, in part, as I've discussed, like you're supposed to be a learned person to access magical textbooks. It's not supposed to be for people who haven't already learned natural philosophy, who haven't have a good understanding of religion. In fact, texts like the Picatrix, the Sworn Book of Honorius, other magical grimoires from the period, they all reinforce in their prologues like, hey, this is not for the unlearned multitudes. This is for a learned man, especially a man who has mastered theology, because that's what's going to keep your soul safe. So given, as this person points out, right, there's this large concern with the sins of the clergy in terms of sexual sin, we see the same thing happening in terms of magical sin. There are several papal bulls that are issued throughout the Middle Ages that are like, hey, clerics, just a reminder, this is bad, right? And there's also a lot written, for example, in Gratian's Decretum, he talks in canon law about like, what do you do with a priest who has been, or a cleric who's been accused of committing like a magical crime, right? Like, do you excommunicate them? Are they sent to do penance? And so one thing I'm actually looking at more in my dissertation, but that's in a future chapter, so I don't have a full answer to you right now. But as I want to compare the punishments for sodomitical acts and magical acts and see, are the penances similar, or are they considered different? Because I think that like in just a couple of examples I've seen, I've noticed a lot of similarities, but I don't have enough data to make a claim that I would feel comfortable right now. But that's one place I think we could see a more clear connection between the two.
Brilliant. So we now have a question on a very different line, which I quite like this one. So this person asks, they were wondering about the development of automata and their depiction in some medieval texts, and whether that raises similar questions about the natural order and disruptions to it.
Yes, 1000%. So Dr. Truitt wasn't able to make it to this talk today, but one person who's on my dissertation committee and who I highly recommend everyone read is Ellie Truitt, who has written, oh goodness, Medieval Robots, a book that's literally about automata in the Middle Ages. And that book really outlines the ways in which automata challenge this idea of like naturalness. For instance, right, like automata, which are, you know, to use Dr. Truitt's term, like basically medieval robots, they appear to operate on their own, right? I'm thinking, for instance, like at the court of Constantinople, there was, you know, like an amazing automaton clock. And it wasn't clear if that clock, like observers to that clock would not be able to tell if that clock was like, is this a magical clock? Like, is it operating thanks to magic, or is it operating thanks to like the ingenuity of automaton? And a lot of times a successful automaton, what made an automaton successful is that they would not be recognizable as an automaton, right? It would be recognizable, like you look at it and go, what is controlling this? How is this happening? So absolutely, I think that there is a lot going on there that's similar, disruptions to it as well. And I think that we see that, you know, I haven't worked on automata in my work specifically, but I would definitely point you, if you're interested in kind of talking about automata and how they operate within / challenge the natural world, Dr. Truitt's book is going to be the best for you. Yeah.
Brilliant. So we have another question, which, this is brilliant. So this is a person who's currently working on a graphic novel set in 9th century Mercia with themes of queerness. And I just want to interject to say I am really excited to read that one day. But this person asks, are there any texts or translations you know of that reference queerness and the preternatural in the early medieval period?
Great question. So this is a little bit outside of my wheelhouse, but Mary, if you want to email me, because I don't work so much on early medieval, I do have friends who I've been talking to who are early medievalists, and I'm sure that they can gather some cool sources for me that I can pass on to you. One thing that I'm thinking about, I don't know if you've read the novel Hild. It is about, oh my gosh, why am I trying to get this wrong? Hilda Whitby, 7th century, 6th century England, abbess, and that novel, I know it's a novel, it's not a primary text, but novel imagines Hild as a bisexual woman. And I think that is based in part on like a good close reading of sources about Hild, and Hild as a female abbess in control of a double monastery. So Hild was in control of a monastery that held both men and women. So double monasteries, my like previous life when I worked on early medieval, like that was my big interest. I was like, what is up with these monasteries when it's supposed to be that like women aren't supposed to be able to like teach theology or be in charge of theology? Double monasteries are monasteries where men and women would live side by side. I mean, they might be in their separate cloisters, like a male cloister and a female cloister, but they are, under the control of one figure. And Hild was a female figure who controlled them. So to me, like, that's just one place I would go. That's like the person who jumps out to me. However, I also know that there's a lot, I wish I could remember what name of the book. King Alfred has, in one of his translations, he talks, like, in one chapter, he talks about like the sin of sodomy, and then like in the immediate next chapter, he jumps to like the sin of magic. And so there's like this kind of juxtaposition there that, although it's not a sentence, it's like these things are connected. I think you could make a case that they were categorized similarly. And one more, sorry, thing that I came across in my reading and prepping for this talk is, so like that Deuteronomy quote that I gave from the Latin Vulgate Bible, it says, do not let, it says maleficus, which is the term for magician, and it's gendered male in Latin, right? Maleficus is a male term. In the in the Old English Alfred translation of the Bible, it says, thou shalt not suffer a woman who uses magic to live. So there's a very specific interpretation of that line in Old English that I think maybe reflects something, I don't know what, but reflects something about the status of magic in early medieval England, where although the Latin is like gendered male, Latin learned male magician, the Old English is like, this is more of a female thing. So it might be an interesting contrast to think about.
Definitely. So I think we've come up sort of to the towards the end of the question, and I think you've done an absolute marathon effort covering so many questions and with all the kind of discussions. So I think if people have any other questions or sort of things they wanted to follow up on, I think Kirsty or myself or Emmy would be very happy to take those by email and pass that on. So I just want to kind of take a moment again to just share my thanks so much for coming out here today to give this talk. Thank you for kind of how you've answered all these questions with such a kind of generousness of academic spirit. So yeah, I think if everyone just takes a moment to say thank you.
Thank you all so much. This has been a real delight. This was my first time giving like a big talk, and I'm just thrilled that so many people are interested and we're asking such cool questions. And what a cool way to spread the work I'm working on. Thanks for listening.
It was absolutely wonderful having you. So our next seminar in the series is going to be next month on 12th of April, and we'll be featuring Fiona Somerset talking on consent, law and theology in late medieval England. And so hopefully we look forward to seeing many of you there. But aside from that, thank you everyone for coming out tonight, and I hope you have a really lovely evening, rest of the week, semester and so on. So see you all around.